the results of the phase 2 alternative water source study. And we've been working on this for approximately the last 18 months. So we have a lot of information to share, and we will try and get through the agenda in a timely manner. So this decision for a new water source is likely to be the largest single decision that the city makes, and also probably the most costly decision that the city makes in this century. And the magnitude of this decision is not lost on me, not as a water professional, or as the Director of Public Utilities, or as a resident of Joliet. So before we get started, just want to go over and make some quick introductions. I'm very impressed with our project team, and we've had a great working relationship over the past 18 months. From the city staff, we have myself, Nick Gornick, who's the plant operations superintendent, and Amy Wagner, who is the deputy director for engineering. And then from the consulting team, we have Teresa O'Grady, who is the project manager, Joe Johnson with Stantec, who is the lead on the Lake Michigan alternatives, Jeff Freeman with EEI, who is the groundwater conservation and water loss lead, Ty Basalki with CMT, who is the river water alternatives lead, Janet Henderson with Images Inc., who is the public relations lead, and then Daniel Abrams with Illinois State Water Survey, who conducted the groundwater modeling. So we have very impressive team compiled with over 115 years of combined water experience. And each of the individuals on the team have expertise in each of the various water sources that we studied, river water, groundwater, and Lake Michigan water. And we also have experts in the industry that are recognized for that. Teresa is the vice president of AWWA. Joe is the lead consultant for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Lake Michigan Allocation Program, and Jeff is the chair-elect for the Illinois section of American Water Works Association. So again, just wanted to provide some of those credentials. The team was highly qualified to complete this work, and everyone can be confident in the work that was completed. So a quick overview of the agenda and some other housekeeping items. So again, I wanted to take the time to do a presentation to the entire group on the results of the phase 2 study. And then we're gonna pause, take a moment for questions and answers. Then we're gonna break up into small groups that we have been doing at these workshops to allow for more in-depth discussions on the decision criteria, and then also discuss a weighted decision matrix tool that you can choose to use to help with the decision-making process. And then we're gonna come back just to wrap up to talk about the selection schedule and next steps. So I just want to be clear, there's no decision-making tonight. We know this is the first time you're going to be seeing and hearing these results, so it's important that you have time to digest that information. If anytime you can call me with questions over the next couple of months, if you have them, I would welcome the opportunity to speak with everyone about how you feel and what other information you might need before making this decision. We're going to be providing a flash drive to everyone on the commission and the city council, and on that flash drive there's going to be a copy of the entire report. So the entire report now is over 600 pages. So initially I was going to print copies, but since this is the Environmental Commission, I felt that much paper would not be appropriate. So right. If you would like a hard copy of the entire report, please see myself or Teresa. We have a few copies on hand tonight that we can provide, but of course, if anyone would like one, we can provide that. In your information that you have on your tables and in the handouts, there is a copy of the executive summary. So if you don't have time to read 620 pages, the executive summary is about 10. So we try and really boil it all down into that for you. And then also for the public, we'll have the presentation on the website, the rethinkwaterjoliet.org. That'll be on the website tomorrow. So anyone from the public can view that document on the website. And we'll also have a hard copy here at City Hall. So if anyone would like to stop and read a hard copy, we'll have that available at City Hall. All right, so time to just jump right into the phase study and report. So just a quick reminder of why we're doing this. We did groundwater modeling in fall of 2018, and that found that at the current usage rates, the city would no longer be able to meet maximum day demands by 2030. So this date had always been thrown around. Is it going to be 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now? But now we do have confidence in knowing that by 2030, we need to have a new source of water online. And this is not a new problem. We've been studying a new source of water for Joliet since the 70s. However, as I mentioned, it was always a little bit ambiguous as to when we would need to have the new water source. So given that there had been previous studies completed, we did feel that it was valuable to start fresh and look at all alternatives equally, given that there's been changes in the regulatory environment, environmental considerations, and other changes that would necessitate having a fresh look at all of the alternatives. The report is unbiased. We use a consistent application of engineering practices to evaluate the alternatives. As I mentioned earlier, we have a team that consists of experts in each of the different water source types, so there wasn't a bias towards any specific water source. The study was done in an open and transparent manner, and that was done with the guidance of the Environmental Commission. And the goal of all of this was to be able to provide enough information to the City Council and Environmental Commission so that you can make a defensible decision that when someone asks, 5-10 years from now, why did we pick this source of water, you will be confident that you had the information available to make that decision. So as I mentioned, this was done very transparently. There was not performed in a vacuum. We had considerable stakeholder engagement with the City Council and the Environmental Commission. This is our third joint workshop. Previously had workshops in April and July. We've also had monthly Environmental Commission meetings that have been open to the public. We've been trying to educate decision makers with the monthly education topic emails. And then again, we've been attending many local community events, trying to bring the message that we need to find a new water source to the people where they already are going to be. We did this through use of the city's billboards, e-blast, social media posts. We also had a community survey, and do want to really put in a plug for the public forum that we're going to be hosting. That's going to be on December 5th, and that's going to be at the VFW Cantigny. And we'll be highly publicizing that event, but for anyone who's watching this at home, the public will definitely have an opportunity to provide input. So the study began in August 2018 with what we called Phase 1. Phase 1 looked at 14 different alternatives, again with a fresh eyes looking at all possible options. From there, we narrowed it down to five viable options that we deemed were worthy of additional study, and that was based on the water quality and water quantity. And so then the 5 alternatives, then throughout Phase 2, we've identified the improvements that are necessary and the costs associated for each of those alternatives. Right, and so these are the 5 alternatives that were narrowed down from Phase 1 for further investigation in Phase 2. You might look at this and say there's more than 5. That's because many of the options had variations that developed as the study progressed. So for example, for the Illinois River, we considered intakes at both the Dresden Pool and the Marseilles Pool. And that was mostly because we were exploring if there was different raw water quality at those 2 locations. For the Kankakee River, there was a purchased water option. I'm looking at buying water from Aqua, Illinois. Then also a new water treatment plant option, which would be located at property the city currently owns at Towpath Lane. For the Lake Michigan DuPage Water Commission option, we looked at and evaluated 2 alternatives. One, main difference being ownership of the transmission main that would carry the water from Elmhurst to Joliet. Similarly, with the Chicago Department of Water Management option, there was 2 options evaluated, the difference being ownership of the transmission main. And the last option that we looked at was a new Indiana intake into Lake Michigan. This map just shows the locations of the potential supply points for each of those options. And as you can see, they are their proximity to Joliet. None of them are close. So before I begin discussing the analysis, it's important to note what the report is and what the report isn't. So as I mentioned, the report is 620 pages of very technical engineering information. But it's also very important to note that the study is conceptual. So what does that mean? That means that the location of facilities, including the transmission main routes, the water treatment plant locations, the pump stations, all of that is conceptual, meaning that it was cited just for the purposes of doing a cost estimate. So the actual location of the pipelines and the water treatment plants, that would be narrowed down as you move into the preliminary design. That level of detail is more suited to a detailed routing study and was outside the scope of this work. So also important to note that we have not completed negotiations. So the pricing that is provided in here for purchased water options, that was what was provided to us, either from the requests for information that we submitted to the suppliers or from discussions that we had with the water suppliers. So again, negotiations would be something that you would do once the water source is selected, and you would begin that process at that time. And just wanted to be clear, so once the alternative is selected, there is significant work that would have to happen. This is really, once we select the source, just the starting point for a 10-year project. And what we've done with this is provide you an opportunity to be able to compare the alternatives equally. So that is really the purpose of a conceptual design, is to allow you to be able to compare the options. All right, so the next two slides, they were going to list all of the background investigations that were completed prior to the analysis of the alternatives. And these should look familiar to the Environmental Commission members, as we've presented on each of these topics at the Environmental Commission meetings. And when you look at the report, all of the information is provided on this in the appendices. So there is a chapter on each of these topics in the appendix of the report. And again, so this is just continuing with all of the background investigations that were completed to provide the basis for the analysis. All right, and so then when you move through the report, you get to chapters on each alternative, and that's where the analysis for each water source alternative is provided. And within each of those chapters, the alternatives are analyzed for both a 30 MGD and a 60 MGD option. So as we've been discussing, since the beginning, there's potential for this to be a solution not only for Joliet, but for the region as well. So that's why we have both a 30 MGD, which would be Joliet only, and 60 MGD, which is for the region. And so within the analysis, we completed the items listed. So we did the conceptual transmission main routing. We did a hydraulic analysis that would determine where we might need pumping stations. We identified then all the overall improvements that we required, the pipes, the pumping stations, the water treatment plants. And then from there, we developed cost estimates. Those cost estimates were then reviewed by an independent cost review firm that was performed by CDM Smith. So the construction cost estimates have been independently reviewed. We then considered all the regulatory and permitting considerations, looked at implementation schedules, and then finally closed those chapters with key considerations. So if you have the report and you want to look at just a specific section on what's the analysis for the Lake Michigan, New Indiana intake option, you can go to that chapter and find all of this information. All right, and this is really hard to read, which is why we have handouts. So this is available in front of you. And so this is kind of it. This is what we've been spending 18 months working towards, is a summary of all of the improvements that would be needed. So on the left-hand side, you have the alternative, and then it goes through and lists the various components for the improvements. And then the question that everyone has been asking since day one is, what are the estimated costs? So if you look at the far right column, that is the construction costs, and it's important to note that those are in 2020 dollars. There's a lot of information on here to spend going through one by one. So the highlight, the construction cost range, it ranges from 300 million to 900 million for the 30 MGD options. And again, we have the 30 MGD and the 60 MGD options just to show the different costs if it was to be a Joliet-only solution versus a regional solution. Also in your packet, there are a couple of exhibits that show the alternative improvements. And it's basically a map that shows where the supply point would be, the conceptual transmission main route, conceptual locations for water treatment plants, and then connection points within Joliet. So there's an exhibit that shows this for the river water options and also an exhibit for the Lake Michigan options. It's important to note that this does not include the improvements that would be necessary to the city's distribution system, which would be significant. Again, we've mentioned before that we would be switching from a multiple input into our system to a single source, so that requires significant improvements within our own distribution system. And it also doesn't include some of the other improvements that are proposed for the river water options. And again, this is the exhibit showing the magnitude of improvements for the Lake Michigan water options. So we've shown the construction costs, but it's important to remember that that is just one component of the true cost of water. And so at the July workshop, we spent a lot of time talking about what is the true cost of water. So the total cost of water is made up of multiple components. They consist of the water supply costs. So that would be costs charged to Joliet to supply the water. So for example, if you had to purchase water. Capital improvement costs. So everyone understands that that's the construction costs. And then the operating and maintenance costs. Each of the alternatives has a varying level of operation and maintenance obligation that it would impose on the city. So it's really important that, we saw the construction costs, but that's just one part of the story. We have to consider these other components of the total cost of water. All right, so in this table, we have presented the total cost of water for the 30 MGD options. And I think the easiest way to understand this is just to walk through an example. So if you were to take the Lake Michigan Chicago Department of Water Management option, which is kind of third from the bottom. Now this is an option where Joliet would own the pipeline. So the first column is the 2020 total capital cost. And so this number of 546 million is how much it would cost to construct the transmission main from the city southwest pumping station to Joliet. Now that's $2020. So when you're looking at the total cost of water, you have to escalate that so that you're accounting for inflation and construction costs, because this isn't going to be constructed in 2020. It's going to be constructed over a 5-year period from 2025 to 2030. So when you include the escalation, the $2030, you get $668 million. Now the next column is buy-in and access costs. So for some options, they charge a buy-in cost, which means that you have to pay for the portion of infrastructure, like potentially their water treatment plant, that they have already paid to construct. But for Chicago, they have informed us that there will be no buy-in cost. When you move to the next column, it's the purchased water cost. This number is $37 million annually. That is how much the city would pay the city of Chicago to buy water. Some of the options, like the river options up above and the Indian option, don't have a purchased water cost because we would not be buying the water. We would be producing the water ourselves. You move on to the next column, it's the additional O&M cost. You might be asking, why is this a negative number? So again, we're purchasing water, so we're no longer having to operate our wells, maintain our wells, our water treatment plants, and because of that, we actually have a reduction in O&M costs. But if you take a look at the river options and the options like the new Indian intake, where you do have to operate a water treatment plant, your O&M costs go up. So the net difference, for example, the Illinois River Dresden Pool will be $17 million per year. Now the last column is additional non-revenue water measures. So we've mentioned this a couple of times before. If we were to switch to a Lake Michigan allocation, they require that our non-revenue water, that's water that we produce but don't charge customers for, that's basically lost in the system, we have to reduce that to below 10%. And so we have prepared a plan over 20 years to reduce that non-revenue water basically through replacing water mains. We've kind of started a program to replace water mains, but we're probably about 50 years behind on doing what needed to be done. So for each of the Lake Michigan options, we've added $8 million annually to address that additional non-revenue water reduction. So when you add these up, all of this combined is where you would get what the true cost of water is. And I think this still doesn't mean much because it's just a bunch of numbers and a table. So what really means something to residents is how is it going to impact my bill? So once you know the total cost of water, you can estimate the approximate increase for the monthly average bill for 2030. So I'll just emphasize again, this is the increase, not the bill cost. And this is only for the water system. It doesn't include sewer or trash. Right now, someone gets their bill, and it includes sewer and trash and water. This increase is just showing the increase that would result from the new water source project. So what are the conclusions? If you look at this, you can see that the bill increases range from an additional $42 for the Illinois River Dresden option to $69 for the Lake Michigan DuPage Water Commission option. So for reference, our current bill is, for an average customer, is $30.75 per month. So if the city were to implement the Illinois River Dresden Pool option, that monthly bill, the portion for water, would be increased by $42. There's other increases likely to occur over the next 10 years to our water bills due to inflation. So
increased by or increased to $42?
Increased by, so you would
72.
add it. 72.
Okay.
Yeah. In comparing the river options to the Lake Michigan options, you can really simplify this by saying Lake Michigan is approximately $1 more a day than a river option. And that's something we have to consider is, is $1 more a day worth it to have Lake Michigan water? So I just have to make sure I point out that there are different color bands on here. The blue bands are the purchased water costs, and the green bands are the new debt service. So you can see how it's differentiated between the options. Where the blue is where you're purchasing the water, and the green, of course, you have more because you're building more infrastructure for the new water treatment plants. And it's important to remember these estimates are conceptual. So the takeaway is that my bill is going to be increased exactly $42 in 2030. There's a lot of information that still has to be determined before those final rates are calculated, but what we do know is that we applied consistent practices in determining these numbers. So for comparison's sake, we are confident that you can compare these using the numbers that we've presented on this table. So we did a very similar exercise for the 60 MGD options. And again, this would be if we had interest from regional partners, other communities that are also having the same issue with the depleted aquifer, or others who are just interested in switching water sources want to participate. And as you can see, it's more infrastructure, so the capital costs increase, purchase water increases, and additional O&M increases as well, since you're operating a larger facility. However, when you look at the impact to the customer's bill, you can see that due to economies of scale, the monthly increase is reduced. So for example, for the new Indiana intake option, the bill increase drops from what was projected to be $68 for the 30 MGD option to $56 for the 60 MGD option. So, there are savings to be realized if there was a regional option implemented. Okay, so we've looked at the true cost of water, and we've looked at the impact to the average customer's bill. However, to get the full picture, you need to look at this another way, which is looking at the cash flow projections and understanding what the total cost is going to be over a 50-year period. So this top projection here is an example of a purchased water alternative. And what you can see is that your purchase costs are going up in perpetuity. And I kind of equate the water purchase costs to if you were renting. If you rent an apartment, you might not be paying as much up front, but your rent is probably always going to go up, and at the end of the day, you don't own anything. You just paid rent. If you look at the bottom option, now this is where we consider the new water system alternative, so an option where we construct our own water treatment plant. And what you see here is that, yes, you have very high debt service payments because you have to pay for all that capital up front. It's like you buy a house, you have to pay for your house, and you have a 30-year mortgage. And yes, you have to make some improvements in your house, might have to replace the AC, might have to, want to put in a new kitchen. But at the end of the day, your debt service goes away. You stop paying your mortgage, you've paid it off. And then at that point, you own a significant asset. So it's important to look at cost in this way as well, and compare what future purchase water costs might be versus future O&M expenditures. So when you use this methodology and you basically total up how much you're going to spend over 50 years for the total cost of water, again, this is for the 30 MGD option, you can see the long-term cost differences between a purchased water option and a new water system. So over time, you see that the options where you are not purchasing water are less expensive. So it could be $2.8 billion or $5 billion. That's for the total expenditures for the total cost of water over 50 years. So again, it's a different way of looking at costs. It's something important to consider in the decision-making process. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about costs, but there's a lot more to than just costs when making this decision. So we spent time at the April workshop talking about non-cost decision criteria, and we've listed these on here, and I'm going to talk about each one in more detail. So the first non-cost decision criteria is the raw water quality. So the question you're asking yourself here is, what is the quality and variability of the raw water source for this alternative? It's important to note that no water source is pure. So we're talking about the raw water. So contaminants exist in all of the alternative sources that we've been considering. So contamination exists in Lake Michigan, it exists in the Kankakee River, and it exists in the Illinois River. We have communicated with IEPA. We did extensive river water quality sampling, And they've stated that there's no red flags that would exclude any of the alternative water sources from consideration, or that would require advanced treatment. So that information has been inputted into the improvements required. So, why does this matter then? Well, Lake Michigan raw water quality is high and consistent, which makes it easier to treat. That would apply to the options where we're purchasing water from Chicago or DuPage Water Commission. The southern end of Lake Michigan is shallower and more susceptible to sediment. So what we've proposed for the new Indiana intake is that we would have a longer intake pipe out into the lake to get past the point where they've had issues. We know that Hammond, Indiana has had issues with icing that have just led to operational issues. So we're proposing a longer intake into Lake Michigan for that option. And then river water sources have variable water quality. So this makes it more difficult to treat. And we've tried to mitigate this concern by having an online backup source to maintain water quality. So what is an online backup source? That means that we would still be utilizing our wells and providing groundwater to the water treatment plant. About 10% of the volume needed would be coming from the wells. That way, then, if there was an upset in the river, there was an algal bloom, or if there was an issue with an illicit discharge, we'd be able to switch 100% to our wells and be able to provide the city in that time period when there is that disruption. And so we've done modeling with the state water survey that shows that our wells could sustain that, that online backup source. All right, the next consideration is sustainability water quantity, and this is a very important decision criteria. We don't want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars and then not have enough water to provide to our residents. So the questions we're asking for this consideration are, does the raw water source have sufficient quantity to supply not only Joliet but also the region? And can the water source be a regional solution? So an important note here is, are there regional partners who would be willing to participate? At this time, we don't know. We did distribute surveys to potential regional partners. Mayor Oderkirk and I did host a luncheon to help initiate conversations on a regional water supply. So from the feedback we received from those questionnaires, 8 of the 12 respondents did say they'd be interested in a new water source by 2030. And of those 8 said they'd be interested in Illinois River water and 10 Lake Michigan water. And that information of those that survey is provided in an appendice to the report. So I just want to run through each of the alternatives and comment on sustainability and water quantity. So the Illinois River quantity is sufficient for both Joliet and the region. And during times of low flow, we would have the online backup supply available. What we did find during this phase 2 study is that there are new low flow conditions on the Kankakee River that are even lower than what we had utilized during phase 1. And that limits its ability to be a regional solution. It also would require water use restrictions during times of low flow. And it would also limit Joliet's future growth. Similarly, the Aqua Illinois grandfathered IDNR permit would also limit its ability to be a regional solution and could limit Joliet's future growth. All of the Lake Michigan options have sufficient water quantity for both Joliet and the region. And we do just want to comment that for the Lake Michigan Water DuPage Water Commission option, where the city would own the pipeline, that would not be a regional option because we were not able to resell water from the DuPage Water Commission. Okay, moving to the next criteria is implementation risk. And here the question is the alternative easy to implement based on scheduling, permitting, and magnitude of improvements? So we are confident that all of the alternatives can be constructed by 2030. For all of them, we've assumed a construction time frame of 5 years, 2025 to 2030, And that was done to maximize the available funding from the state loan program. That doesn't say that some of them can't be constructed in a shorter time frame, but our recommendation would be to extend the time frame to maximize the availability of those loans. So for these alternatives, I think it's easy to understand that when you're buying water, there's less risk because it's less complex. There's no treatment, no construction of a treatment plant, and there's no permitting of that treatment plant. So definitely the options where we're buying water, they would have less risk. Alternatives with water treatment plants are more complex and would require treatment construction and permitting. One risk that we've identified through discussions with the IEPA is additional sampling that would be required for the Illinois River option. We have done 4 months of sampling, but they would require a minimum of 12 months of sampling. So we would still need to do additional sampling to prove to the IEPA that the Illinois River water source would be able to be utilized for Joliet. However, they did provide us with initial feedback saying that there aren't any red flags that would indicate that it would not be able to be used as a water source based on the 4 months of sampling that we submitted to them. And then lastly, there's more complexity with the new Indiana intake options simply because of crossing state lines. We've had discussions with Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Indiana Department of Natural Resources, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. And again, there haven't been any red flags that have been put up, but again, there'd be added complexity with dealing with multiple agencies. Okay, and lastly, just talk about operation and maintenance. And does this alternative require significant O&M responsibility, or does the alternative require O&M for improvements outside city limits? So more responsibility means more liability. So if we own a pipeline in Indiana and it breaks, then the city of Joliet is obligated to go out and fix that water main. So two of the options with DuPage Water Commission and the Chicago Department of Water Management have options where the supplier would construct, own, operate, and maintain that transmission main. So in those scenarios, we would not be responsible for maintaining infrastructure outside of Joliet. That results in less O&M costs and risk. All the other alternatives have varying levels of improvements outside city limits. So the alternatives with new water treatment plants, they have significant O&M responsibility because we would be operating a water treatment facility, which is something we currently do not do. And lastly, none of the sources are close to the city. So supply points range from 13 miles to 42 miles from Joliet. So there'll be significant increase in operations and maintenance responsibilities. Okay. And the last decision criteria, really the last one this time, is control and governance. Does the alternative give the city control of their water source? So with a few of the options, there is limited to no control, and that's those options where you're purchasing water. So if we were to purchase water from Chicago Department of Water Management, the city of Chicago sets the rates, and then that is the rates that we would pay. You would try and negotiate some rate stability in your contract potentially, but ultimately we would not have control over that. There's some governance potential with the DuPage Water Commission option, since a commission does exist, that you would be able to have some representation. And then the new water source alternatives, where we would construct, own, and operate the entire system, we would have complete control. So the schedule, partnering, selling water, and setting rates would all fall under the responsibility and control of the City of Joliet City Council. Okay, so I know I've been talking a lot. Hopefully, thank you for sticking with me. It's a lot of information. Just kind of want to start wrapping it up by stating that there's no perfect alternative. As we've been going through this, I think you can pick up on ones where there's none of them score perfect on when you look at the decision criteria. We have a lot of information, but we're at a conceptual stage. so we have to take that in consideration. So what we're recommending is that when we move forward, we select a primary alternative as well as a select secondary alternative, and that when we move into the work we're going to perform in 2020, that we keep in mind that we have a backup option in case something comes up with the preferred alternative and we're not able to move forward with it. So please just keep that in mind when you're looking at this. That's what we're recommending, is to have an alternative option to fall back on. So a lot of people want to know, how can we make this decision when we don't have all the information? And given our deadline of 2030 to have a new source of water online, we really need to make a decision in January of 2020, so there's enough time to do the design, permit, and construct the improvements. So we feel confident with the information we've presented that you can make that decision. So for the project team, there are some of the alternatives that, after looking at the phase 2 criteria, have fallen off the table. So these are ones that we are no longer recommending for consideration. This would be the Kankakee River option at Towpath Lane. There's low flow conditions, as I mentioned earlier, that would require water use restrictions and limit the ability of this option to be a regional solution, and also limit Joliet's future growth. Similarly, the Aqua Illinois option we're no longer recommending due to its limitations to be a regional solution, and also limitations on Joliet's future growth. For the DuPage Water Commission options, these are also no longer recommended, as they're higher costs due to the second tier water purchase, and also limitations on being a regional solution. So for that option, if we have the option to purchase water directly from the city of Chicago, there will not be a reason to pay more money to buy the water from DuPage Water Commission, who purchase it from the city of Chicago. So of the remaining 3 alternatives, there's varying pros and cons. So the alternatives we have remaining are the Illinois River, Lake Michigan from Chicago Department of Water Management, and Lake Michigan through a new Indiana intake. And they vary based on the decision criteria. So the total cost is lowest with the Illinois River and highest with Lake Michigan new Indiana intake when you look at the 2030 average monthly residential water bill increase. However, when you look at the 50-year total water cost, the lowest is Illinois River and the highest is purchasing water from Chicago. The highest raw water quality is from Lake Michigan, Chicago Department of Water Management, or the new Indiana intake. All 3 have sufficient water quantity to be regional solutions. When you're looking at O&M responsibility, the options where we're constructing a new water treatment plant, the new Indiana intake, or the Illinois River have the highest O&M responsibility. When you're looking at implementation risks, the risks are higher with the Illinois River because of the additional sampling requirements that IEPA is requiring, and also with the Lake Michigan new Indiana intake because of the added permitting complexity that we spoke about earlier. And then lastly, when you look at control, the options where you're constructing your own water treatment plant and not purchasing water allow for total control. So I guess the big question is, how do we make a decision? Presented a lot of information. I know it's going to take a while for everyone to fully digest everything. Each of the alternatives is very different. We have incorporated components to provide a consistent basis of comparison. For example, I know there's been concerns with the Illinois River at times of low flow or upsets, and to mitigate that concern, we've included the online backup component of it. There's many considerations more than just cost, so we have to look at those other phase 2 criteria we've discussed, such as control, risk, operation and maintenance, and also water quantity. But in addition to all the criteria I've been discussing tonight, there's several non-technical factors. And these are ones as a project team we cannot put a number and assess the significance of these. These include public perception and acceptance of the water source. If someone's going to be paying a lot more money for their water, we'd like them to at least be supportive of the water that they'll be then drinking. Regional partner interest in water sources. There's could be a preference if we're trying to be a regional option where regional partners might be interested in one water source over another, which could then result in lower bills for Joliet residents. And then perception of water suppliers. I think it's no surprise that people have had concerns with losing control and purchasing water from the city of Chicago. So, that is, again, a non-technical factor that we can't put a rating on. So before I go into more detail on the weighted decision matrix, that's the last item we have to discuss. Just wanted to pause and see if there's any questions. I have the project team available for any questions as well. And as I said earlier, if you have any questions, I know it's a lot of information, you can call me at any time and I can get responses. We're intending to send out Q&A weekly to everyone so everyone's informed of what questions are being asked.
There's a few behind you. I have a couple real quick. Number one, when you talked about water main costs and $8 million a year budgeting for the Lake Michigan, do you think there's something we should do regardless of where we go? We're losing 30% of our water.
That's a good question. So the $8 million is in addition to the approximately $10 million that we already intend to spend on water main replacement. So addressing non-revenue water is something that we need to do regardless. It's just with the Lake Michigan options, we would be required to do it in a more accelerated fashion.
All right, number two, I don't know if I saw this. There's a cost to clean the water. Was that factored in the River, Illinois, and where I didn't see that cost?
Yeah, so that's part of the operation and maintenance costs.
Okay.
So that's where the water treatment plant and the treatment cost would be.
All right, number three, the options that you're now recommending come off the table: Kankakee River, DuPage Water Commission, and Aqua.
Mm-hmm.
That's a recommendation. The committee still, ultimately, if they want, could go one of those routes. They can still choose.
Yes,
it.
that's just staff's recommendation at this
Okay.
point.
And then finally, with the city of Chicago or with Hammond, there's been no negotiation. So I know we're making estimates, but we really don't know what the price would be, or if we couldn't negotiate a contract where it doesn't go up for 30 or 40 years. That's still an option.
That is still an option. So the pricing that this was based on Chicago provided a response to the request for information, and in that they identified what the cost per unit of water would be. And then similarly, we had met with Hammond, and they provided preliminary information on those access costs.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Allison, have we done any preliminary investigation in the federal and state grants that would qualify, especially if we decide to be regional? Because this is a problem, as I tell people, water and debt is what's going to cause wars going for the next 50 years.
Yeah, so we have begun looking at, and there is an appendix in the report that is specifically for funding strategies. And what we found in doing that initial investigation is that there really isn't a lot of free money options. So the good news is that there are very flexible federal loan programs, and we applied, submitted a notice of a letter of intent for one of them called WIFIA this summer, and we found out in October that the city has been selected to submit an application for that. So that WIFIA program would be able to finance up to 49% of the project costs and has very favorable repayment terms. You don't have to begin repayment until 5 years after construction is complete, and you could then fund it for a 30-year term at a low interest rate.
So if we finish it in 30, we would start repaying it in 35?
That's correct. And that's how that cash flow projection was based on that WIP.
So we would be looking at, if we were to increase rates, depending on what we choose, immediately to meet the future debt load,
That is
we'd be
correct.
looking at 40 years.
Yes, so, when you...
Are these based on 30, Allison, these numbers?
30?
30-year bonds?
Yeah, so the complete funding strategy that this is based on would be 49% would be paid for through WIFIA, which is the program I just described. We have talked to IEPA. So currently, you're probably familiar, I've mentioned SRF funding a lot. So that's where, when we've constructed our wastewater treatment plant projects, we have borrowed money from the state. And what we've talked to with the state is that they feel that they can provide us $50 million annually, which is why we would look to extend the construction period. And again, that is a low interest loan, 2 to 3%, 30 years, 2 to 3% interest. Then the balance, if there is a balance, would have to be paid with, we would take out revenue bonds. And those, again, we would assume a 30-year payment term, but at a higher interest rate.
And it's 2 to 3%, you said, for the Illinois portion of the loans.
Yep.
If revenue bonds were to come in under 3%, what's the maximum we can get on a bond? 30, 40, 50 years?
I was discussing that we would typically, probably do a 30-year loan.
The reason I'm asking this is we look at this and we do have the option to spread the debt over 50 years. It'll be less front-loaded.
That's correct. And so the funding strategy, again, would be something that we would fine-tune after the source is selected and we move into into the next phase. We would, we've already been talking with our financial advisors, the people who are really experts in this, and there's probably creative financing out there that when you're borrowing this much money, you would be looking to try and be as creative as possible to, as you said, try and distribute that debt.
So this is kind of very preliminary, not very, but preliminary still. It's kind of the worst case scenario, say on a 30-year scale. If we can manage to go out 50 years, we'll see less of an increase up front and a more consistent increase over the 40, 45, or 50 years.
That's correct. That's why I want the takeaway to be when everyone looks at those rate increases, that's based on those assumptions. However, we'll of course look for better options that would lower that increase.
Now, in the Lake Michigan new pipeline through Indiana, is that the option that you've summarized here? Is that Joliet doing it alone, or is that part of the Southland concept?
So the Southland group is still very early developmental stage. So the option that's presented here is just for Joliet to do it alone and provide the pipeline out. However, we have talked with Southland, and there's an option where if their group becomes more developed and if there is interest in partnering, we could definitely, that could also be an opportunity to explore where they would potentially either share responsibility for the intake and transmission main out of Indiana, or we could sell raw water to that agency and they could have their own treatment plant to serve.
Which, again, if we got that kind of revenue, would add towards the payment of our debt.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Did we, in these estimates, consider future growth, new customers? Mm-hmm. So that's it, okay.
Yes.
And did we include, or do we have an estimate of revenue by selling to the others? And how many liked the Illinois River versus how many liked Lake Michigan? I thought you said 10 and 8.
Yeah, that is correct. So we distributed the survey to 15 communities. We received 12 responses. And like I said, of the 12, there was 8 who would be interested. However, that survey went out to other communities that already have Lake Michigan water, for example, Plainfield on New Lenox. So under those alternatives, those communities would only switch to an option that was.
So I misunderstood. That's what caught me. You said 10 and 8. I'm like, this 18. How did we get that?
Yeah.
10 said they would take only Lake Michigan. 8 said that they would do Illinois, but the same 8 would do it in Lake Michigan too. Mm-hmm. So essentially, 2 said what? They wouldn't be interested in either?
Yeah, like I said, a lot of people, and when they completed the survey, they were, I think there needs to be greater discussions before people will want to formalize their response of what they're interested in. So I think that was very preliminary. So I know there's representatives from other communities here tonight. So there's definitely interest in people becoming educated on this, and we'll continue those efforts to seek out regional participation.
So it would seem at the point we're at now, Allison, that while we'll consider all the other factors, the reselling factor, the most attractive one seems to be the Lake Michigan option for reselling the water.
Yes.
Okay. I think that might be it for now.
I will say that cost was, people added also to their survey, we asked them the same questions, which of the criteria were important And so, cost was also important, and that is a question that a lot of the communities are asking me is how much would Joliet charge? And that's a question that we would have to develop over the next year and answer to.
And I think I have some ideas, but that's something that we need to develop as a separate track, right? One other thing, just out of curiosity, how many miles to the proposed Indiana Lake Michigan, and how many miles to the Illinois?
So the Indiana one is, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, I believe 42 miles. And then for the Illinois River Dresden is 13 miles.
Okay. Yeah, because actually, by the time you got to your presentation, where you said essentially the ones that you would propose, I had already X'd out those. So, we're kind of thinking alike there. That's all I have, man.
Mike?
Allison, I know that at some point in time, will you be able to, once you know which selection, once you know or the options we have, and once we know how many years the bonds are going to be, things like that, will you be able to break it down for each category, what the estimated rate increase would be for each residential customer?
So we have calculated the bill increase, and so really the rate increase would be dependent upon what strategy we decided to go with. Is it we gradually raise the rates over the next 10 years, or do we wait until 2030 to raise the rates? So I don't think at this point we can say a rate increase, besides to say, in general, when you look at these bill increases, for some it's double our current amount, and for others it's triple.
At some point in time, we'll get to that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, once we move forward into the, the detailed, preliminary design with the specific alternative, and all of these conceptual numbers start to get fine-tuned, then we would develop that strategy.
Thank you.
Have you done any projections as far as the potential income if we were a regional supplier to offset the costs?
So we did have the table in here that shows what the bill increase would change to if we were a regional provider, and assuming we had 60 MGs. That's not your question?
I'm sorry, maybe I meant as far as what revenues we may be receiving as a regional to offset those costs. Do we
I'll
have
turn
any
to Joe.
projections?
He can respond to that.
At this point, just to keep the analysis simple, we originally did it assuming that spreading out the cost of water equally to Joliet and the regional customers. And we looked back and we said, let's assume that there would be a 5% markup on the cost of water to the regional customers. So the idea is that in the calculation, there's a little bit of an offset that reduces the cost to Joliet customers by marking up the water that would be sold to regional customers. That's a completely hypothetical value right now, and something that can be adjusted in the model. But that's what's reflected right
Yes,
now.
thank you.
Anything else up here? I know there's committee members that had questions. You guys want to line up?
I had one quick question while they line up.
Sure.
Allison, you've got a staff recommendation on the options that you presented tonight. Certainly, we're going to consider it. Is there going to be a meeting where the commission votes on their recommendation?
Yes, so the selection schedule moving forward is there is an environmental commission meeting scheduled on December 10th. So again, we ask the commission, take the next month, dive into the information, ask us questions, and then at that meeting, we'd be seeking a recommendation from the environmental commission. This would then be presented to the city council at the first meeting in January for a vote on January 7th by the city
So
council.
at the January meeting, we'll have a recommendation from staff and consultants, as well as a recommendation from the commission. Thank you.
Come on up.
Two questions. Commissioner Horn and I visited City Hall, conforming with the Open Meetings Act, and reviewed the RFI. And we see where DuPage Water Commission did not submit, Aqua did not submit, but the Public Water Commission did submit, and the Southland did submit. I'm just wondering why they are not on here.
So again, when we move forward with the option that is selected, I discussed the Southland Group and what involvement they could potentially have in the future. For the Public Water Commission, that's an entity that exists that could be used if we wanted to have a regional solution. Joliet's currently a member of the Public Water Commission. So, that type of governance would be something we would discuss moving into the following year. So they're not excluded, it's just they're not a source of water since neither of them is an existing supplier of water.
Okay, I have a question on that. Was the Public Water Commission emphasizing Kankakee River?
Yeah, so the Public Water Commission does own property on the Kankakee River. However, it's basically a governance structure, so they could exist for any water source.
Yes.
So they could become quote-unquote customers at some point.
Yes, they
Were
could.
any of the members part of your survey?
Yes.
I don't understand the answer for the Southland Group. They're incorporated, they submitted a contract, they submitted 40 pages of engineering, and when you break down their engineering and subsequent questions that were asked, it seems to me that, off the top of my head, this $1,130,400,000 that Joliet would do it alone would bring Joliet's cost down to maybe 500, which is a very comparable figure to the Dresden pool. So, in or out, that's just what I'm looking for. Are they going to be considered in or out?
Allison, I guess the first step is if Lake Michigan was chosen, would Southland be part of the conversation, or is that your question?
Yeah, and I met with a representative from Southland, last week to just give them an update, and they gave me an update on where they are. I mean, again, currently the Southland Group is 3 communities in South Chicago who have formed to find an alternative to City of Chicago water. They currently purchase water from the City of Chicago, so they don't have critical mass to take on a significant project, so they would need many more members before they would be a viable alternative. However, Joliet does have that critical mass that we are able to proceed, at this time.
My follow-up to that would be, is if they're incorporated, if they are commissioned, then they would fall under the 1985 Water Commission Act in Illinois, which would give them certain rights and privileges for financing. So I just want to make sure that they're not out. My second point, the devil's in the details. Joliet produces 1,000 gallons of water for 70 cents. 0.0000054 an ounce. With a 28% water loss on 20 million gallons a day, Joliet loses yearly almost $6 million. Lost revenue by not selling the water, and then the cost to Joliet for producing the water. And if that number is never zero, Joliet, and it'll never be zero, but depending on how you structure things, you will lose at least $1 million a year in water loss revenue, non-revenue water, however you want to term it, okay? Number 2, or 3, 1 billion. Chicago processes 1 billion gallons daily of Lake Michigan water, 22% of the fresh water supply. There's a cost to doing business, and then there's a cost to not doing business. They do this in a very conventional manner. No ultraviolet lights, like Peoria, okay? No drastic decontamination. They don't have to worry about ComEd releasing water in the Dresden pool. okay? But if you purchase their water at $4 per thousand, at a 20 million, and you're talking 30 million up there, at 20 million a day average, you're gonna pay Chicago $29.2 million a year at 20, and I believe Allison already said it'd be 37 million. But at the same time, the water loss of that purchased water, okay, I turn my page, is $8.176 million a year. So you purchase at 4, you lose at 28%, you'll be losing $8.176 million a year by buying water. Whether it's DuPage, which is $5 per 1,000, or Chicago at 4. Then the next item I'd like to cover is that our wells are probably the best asset that the city of Joliet has. 70 cents per 1,000 gallons. It's unheard of. And the council's been informed, as we have, that in the year 2025, it's being recommended that we add another well. Well water can be commingled with lake water prior to the treatment process. This would tremendously use the asset of the wells, reduce the cost, reduce the price if you're going to sell the water, and the wells should not be given up until they've run their due course of time, until they quit producing. Today I read the Illinois Water Survey says 2040, okay? This is a tremendous asset, these wells, to produce water at 70 cents. And with that, that's my last question and comment.
Thank you.
Mark Hoffman from the Environmental Commission. I want to thank Allison and everyone involved. This is, a great report and a lot of information here. Helps me to clarify things in my own head. There was one question I had in terms of price and cost that I didn't see reflected here. I'm wondering if there was information on that, which was the potential impact of these water choices on property value. And that could go either way, and it depends on if you're renting, you're buying, but we're talking about $30 more between the options, but then if that impacts property value / tax and things like that, I think that might be something to take into account. So is that something we have information on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. As I mentioned earlier, there's, all these non-technical factors and how you evaluate them. I mean, currently we have not looked at the difference in property value. However, we, have probably people who are on our commission who might be able to assist with that input.
Yeah, and that actually, since John brought that up, that I do think when I was very early considering these options, just the real estate in terms of we have Lake Michigan water, it does make sense to save money in the way you're saying, but then you can no longer say it's purely Michigan water. So, but I think that's an interesting option to take into account there. So that's all I wanted to bring
Okay,
up.
thank you, Mark.
Lake Michigan water increases land value, right? We discussed that.
Right, no, I was curious if we could have it itemized out.
Mark, if you could speak in the mics, they can't hear you at home.
So I was just curious if that had been calculated and
We'll investigate that and provide some input on that before December 10th meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Allison, I liked your analogy regarding renting and owning. And one thing that I questioned the city of Chicago when they came and presented was the previous mayoral administration in Chicago, they were tightening up the lease term or the contract for the term in which you could purchase water. Now, obviously, there's a large infrastructure cost to go to Indiana or to Page Water Commission or to the city of Chicago intake. When I asked some pointed questions, they said that they would reopen that for the city of Joliet and we could get a much longer term I was asking like into perpetuity. Has there been any discussions relative to what that term would be with the city of Chicago, and then more, and then also, they answered some of that question. I don't know anything with respect to Hammond, because certainly those are a more costly option for the city. So if we're going to choose one of those Lake Michigan options, we need to be ensure that it truly is not a rental situation, and we're in a very long-term relationship for the life of the infrastructure at least.
Yeah, those are all good points, and those are details that you would move forward with during the negotiation process. I've not spoken with City of Chicago since they made their presentation, so I anticipate they're still moving forward with the rate study that they had discussed, and then also mentioned they would be open to looking at those terms. So for Hammond, the previous arrangement they had negotiated with other groups was, I believe, a 75-year arrangement. But again, that's something that we're coming in at this with a fresh take. So I would consider anything on the table at this point.
And just to follow up, most of those council members probably know, but the city of Chicago had been discussing like a 10 or 15 or 20-year term, right?
Joe, was there anything in their response that indicated the term?
Also, I don't recall off the top of my head. I know they currently have the agreement that they negotiated with DuPage Water Commission when it came into existence was a 40-year agreement. But Chairman Anderson, you are right. They've been discussing as they're renewing agreements, shortening those. I will go back and look at their RFI and see if they specified a term and see if we can provide that information to you.
Okay. And when we were, I'm not having revisionist history, right? When I asked that question, they said that they were open to extending that.
Yes, in the presentation they made, I think they indicated a strong willingness to work with Joliet to try to find a solution that would be workable for both parties. So I think, as Allison pointed out, I think there is an opportunity for discussions with them that maybe hasn't existed in recent years.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
Quick follow-up question on
Yes.
that comment. But Chicago would not allow us to resell.
No, if we purchase water from the City of Chicago, we could resell the water. It was with DuPage Water Commission that we would not be able to resell the water. Okay, so
Are we taking public comments, questions yet, or will that be?
that was at the conclusion of the
Okay.
agenda. Okay, so quickly with the weighted decision matrix, I mentioned it earlier. And so what is this? It's just a tool that you can utilize to help in the decision-making process. If you don't want to use it, you don't have to use it. It will not be turned in. It's not homework. Again, this is just something that staff created. I know there's a lot to consider here. It's a very big decision. So we wanted to give you a tool that you could use in the decision-making process. And so what is this? Basically, what staff has done has gone through those decision criteria that I discussed in the presentation, and we have then rated each of the options based on our technical expertise and professional opinion on those ratings. And so then what you would do, because each person has a different opinion on which of these criteria are the most important, you would go into this spreadsheet and only have to change 6 numbers. You would go in and put a percentage for each of those decision criteria based on which one you think is most important. And of course, those percentages have to add up to 100%. And if it's not 100%, you'll get false in that column. So basically what happens is, by taking your weight of those decision criteria, it breaks down into what your preferred alternative would be. And again, this is your preferred alternative just based on those technical considerations. It doesn't take into account the non-technical considerations such as property values and public acceptance. So those you would have to then consider after you receive these results. So what we're going to do, I know I ran through that really quickly, is break into small groups and actually go through an example of how you can utilize this tool. And I believe, Anne, on the name tag, it indicates the groups. Okay, so on the packet or on the name tag?
On their name tag.
On your name tag, it indicates what group you're in.
One.
Okay.
What do you got? I'll take that.
So group number 1 is in the northwest corner. The northwest corner is that corner. Group 2 is in the southwest corner. Group 3 is southeast corner, and Group 4 is northeast corner. So if you don't know what group you're in, I have a sheet up here. I can help you find the right group.
How long is it?
What group you in, Bob?
One.
One? Don, what group you in?
The public, if you can just decide which group you want to participate in. Spread yourselves out.
Hey, where you at?
Going with Don. Anywhere Don's going, I'm
This where you going?
I'm for it.
Do we have to take our papers with us?
Yeah.
They took theirs.
Not sure what's scary, right?
Signature road, a whole lot easier than I thought. Pretty good. Towards about, probably about 2,500. Well, maybe 1,000.
Yes.
How are you?
Someone seats here. Is mine how you doing?
Nobody wants to be in court?
We get a lot done.
Wonderful.
With all this information.
Testing.
Makes sense. So, part of the flash drive that you guys will get with the report is some files with this decision maker. And so you can go around and say that you answer your own without and all that stuff. What we're going to just talk through in this discussion, and then you can log on to one of those. Council, yeah. So, it's almost better than Facebook. But what we'll do is we'll go through last try. As an example. And then plug it into tools, we can see then what values we get. So that we just work through this. So, our Allison went through the decision criteria. Total cost of the water is.
Adds up to 100%.
Yes.
Everybody would have the percentage. But these were the items that they started decisions.
That was part of that big table right here. The last column of this is the construction of all the options. And so in this table, the last column, yeah, so if you look at the.
This is construction.
Yep. Right, and that's not our infrastructure, right? That's no construction as such.
Sustainability.
It's not our infrastructure.
Me personally.
Well, no, this includes distribution system modifications. And so this.
Sustainable water source. And the ones that have been recommended certainly are sustainable for your future, in my opinion. Some more than others. Then we got risk. Each of them have risks. So how much is risk to you in this whole thing? I think they all have risks. So maybe you're saying relative. It doesn't matter because they all have risks. So it could be a 0 for you, but maybe risk is a big part. So it's a 10% for you. O&M, there's O&M cost. Allison went through them briefly, some of them more than others. What does that mean to you as far as how important it is? If you own and operate your own treatment plant, you'll have O&M. You'll have
chemicals, you have staff, you have electricity bills to pump, and so on and so forth. And that's all part of the O&M. And this one was really big when we first started out phase one, control. Joliet has control of its future destiny. It can resell water to future customers to help get that total cost of water down to Joliet's customers, to be able to grow and be a regional supplier. I think that's a big one. All of these are on the decision-making matrix. Even though a few of them were not recommended tonight, that doesn't mean it's not your recommended. Everybody's going to have their own opinion on this. And so we can go through here on the computer if there's not any questions so far about this.
Again,
Okay.
looking at the impact to the monthly bill,
We can. I would think that everybody probably want to do this on their own, is what I would think, and come up with their own conclusions. But we can do one as an example here that maybe I would say. So if we have to come up with 100%, you had these up to make sure we don't have to do so. Okay.
and so yes, there is.
I will. Okay, so
Public Water Commission or some other.
are there any of these categories that don't
That they.
If you tell people we're
any of them
water out of the
just don't need to be up there? I think all of them are important. Yeah, and some of them just more than others. So, yeah. So I'm going to say that they are all a yes. So, ranking the criteria, which are most important to you. So, let's go through this. I don't want everybody to have to do it, and then it's theirs, and it pops up and it says, that's your choice. So let's just do an example then, okay? So I would say, I think that for me, sustainability is number one, okay? So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to rank this as number one. Then I'm going to go in and I'm going to say control. Okay? Control of your own destiny.
And I think it's going to be even more important.
Then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say cost. And cost can definitely be a lot of people. I'll be surprised if it's not. Okay. Now let's go through here and see what we got left here. We have raw water quality, implementation risk, and O&M. I'm going to say that out of the 6, this might be last because we've already decided that everything get into this level can be treated. Now, that may be different for anybody else. You may say, I want Lake Michigan water, and so my choice, that changes my decision. Let's just do that now. Okay. And then we'll say that risk is 4, and O&M is 5. So if we went through these, then we'd say that the highest percentage would be here. Okay? So let's just say, and this is just for my example, okay, here for this. So let's say that that's 30%. Okay? Now we got to come up with percentages for the rest of these. Well, number 2, we've got control. Let's call that 15. And we can make these the same too. We said cost was 15. Now we're at 60%, and we have 3 remaining, right? Let's go here. Let's say this is a 10. Will that work out there? Let's call that hey, I got myself in a number bind here. Mayor, help me out here. Okay. Yeah. So that's 30. That's okay. 75. You could do 10 and 5. Does that add up? Is that right? Okay. Let's say it does. Okay. So now let's go through this example here.
You guys think is a consensus?
That makes sense.
Okay, so we're gonna say yes there. Raw water quality.
can these sources?
So again, raw water, it doesn't,
No.
finished water
This is
quality
the city of
is the
Joliet
same.
computer.
It's just how difficult it is to treat, whether you need an online backup.
Bank accounts, Quiz knows everything.
Potential for
Okay, so let's go ahead and pull this up and
premise is that the finished water quality is
put
gonna
this in a
be
different
same
direction so everybody can see.
for all of
Yeah, I do think that might be the easiest. And the television camera's coming from that way, so you'll get to be on TV. Yep. So let's see. So if we went through here, now we did this. So we went right here first. So that's total cost. What did we say the percent was on that? 15.
You don't care how much Juliet has to
That's
operate
actually
and
what I was
maintain?
gonna say. I kind of went through this before the meeting and kind of thought on my own as if I were making this.
Now we're at
Yeses in all those boxes. So I kind of thought.
raw water. What do we say that was?
So do you guys think yeses and everything?
Okay. Sustainability, we said 30. Let's see if this adds up. Implementation,
The water to get it to where we need.
this in the 15. Does that need to be
Yes.
10?
So I just don't feel that's.
O&M?
The other one would be this implementation when you were using.
So, now what do we got?
The complexity of the implementation.
Oh, it added up. Okay. So,
Those are all things we construction.
what this does then, let me do this. Just went ahead and ranked these. And so, our highest one here with that is the Lake Michigan water, based upon the decisions we made. Okay? And so it can turn out different for everybody else, but so this one is a huge one right here. The Lake Michigan alternatives are really best for sustainability.
Periods or water quality periods. That's those are the water options. For Lake Michigan, it's assumed that wells are offline, meaning if they have
Yeah.
to be turned on, they could only be turned on after storage is exhausted, they'd go direct into the system. So that's, in both cases, the wells would be effective.
Right. And you know, everybody will have their own opinion on this. I mean, it'll be kind of fun to do it and see how it turns out. It's different than what your preconceived best choice is. That's what it came out for me when I did it the first time too. Is that alternative? But the thing about that is
You think the implementation risk is
you've got this here. You don't
not
really have it as much. I mean, if that was a 30, would it change things? It just depends how you look at the whole thing.
sustainability, water quality, yes. Okay.
So that's on the flash drive. It's an Excel spreadsheet.
Is control a yes?
Open it up. It's got these
So
different
what do you
tabs
think
at the
about
bottom.
Implementation.
So where's
Yes or no?
so the very first one? It's got instructions.
Is this next thing we have to do is rank them?
Then that ranking is another one,
Amongst these
but
that you said yes.
it's already known. Just go straight in
Number
there.
one.
And
Sustainability.
that's how you can complete that.
Total cost?
Yeah.
Sustainability? Okay, so what do we think? 3 for total cost, 2 for sustainability, so those, that's a 1, 2. What about these others?
There's a little bit of control.
Control is 3.
Sure.
O&M 4.
This is really about, this has to do with, you want to.
So now, we have to say, out of 100%, how much is
As far as the
cost?
The complete report is on that. Okay.
50% of your decision, 40, 30, 20, 80.
And just for reference, 100% divided by 6 different things is about 16. You know, like if everything was just about 16. So priority, then you're going to go above 16.
You can get some as 0, so let's start there. Are any of
Right.
these 0?
Raw water's got to be bottom.
What do you think groundwater? Maybe 5%?
Right.
Implementation risk? Okay.
I mean, yeah.
At 20 to 25%.
This is really just a tool because it's not apples and apples that you're comparing, and all the different elements of it. Some are more important are to others, right? So it's just a tool to help you. It doesn't mean that you fill it out and the number one comes up, and that has to be your decision.
Okay, next one down is control.
Use it on your own. I think it's very helpful.
Are you guys gonna be ready to make this decision in a month?
No, I mean, I've
Through-
been talking
Okay, operation and maintenance?
the cost thing was very.
But again,
So,
this is why just get rid of things.
Again, I think that's gonna be the most cost. I mean, we have a big dollar amount
schedules.
of total cost, but
December.
several decades.
I
Think
personally,
about why
just my personal
based on
opinion,
what else is
This
presented.
project is gonna
in the event that
occur.
we make a decision, if it's a good idea December 15th, it'll be a good idea January 15th. And I think it's gonna change the future of water supply for Joliet if we're not prepared to make decisions. So, I mean,
I'd like to be. Yes, it would be nice if we were, and I think it's possible, but if we get to that point and we're not comfortable yet,
I mean, my charge, and I mean, obviously, serve your pleasure, but my charge to each commissioner is if there's not unanimity that people feel comfortable making decisions, I personally have no problem.
Okay, so now,
You know, ultimately, you tell us.
Well, I think this isn't something that can be rushed, and it hasn't been. I mean, it's been very thorough, but no sense, like you said, going halfway down.
I guess that was one of my questions as well, is what is the lead time to complete the worst case scenario situation, which would be building the pipeline 44 miles to Indiana? And what, you know, of course, 10 years, of course that can be done, but what is the real time frame of completing that type of
For
project?
all of the options, 5-year construction period was assumed, starting in 2025. That means that before 2025, you have to have permitting, design, environmental reviews done, and those sort of things that lead up to it. But 5 years for the actual construction. Could that be accelerated? Could you
and I've played with this
phases
many
Yes,
times.
at the
anything.
same time? Of course, all
Right.
those things can be done. And I think that really is a discussion for the next phase after you choose the water source. Those are very good questions.
Number are you looking at?
We could really talk about in detail in the next phase.
A couple of the options are very simple. You build a pipeline, you don't need to build a water treatment plant. Right? For instance, Chicago, we're buying treated water, so we don't need to build a whole new 50-acre water treatment plant. So I would assume the construction schedule, if we went to Chicago or Page Water Commission, would be condensed from that 5 years.
And you've got finished water storage requirements if you buy in Chicago. I don't remember off the top of my head if it was 2 days or 3 days of storage, which is a lot of finished water storage that you'd have to construct and have here at Joliet with that option. So there's other things. There's improvements to your existing distribution system, because how it is now, it's coming in at multiple points. And you're talking about one source bringing it in, so you have to have distribution system modifications done too. And all of those things be happening at the same time. There's a lot of work.
When I think about the operations and maintenance of the project overall, when I think about the maintenance and operations of the project, I'm also thinking about the pass-through cost. If you're building a pipeline, what are those subjective costs going through each one of the municipalities, each one of the counties that they're going to add on to, that we can't see that cost on the back end? And that, of course, is a variable that's extremely high. And how do you control it?
Right. So on the pipeline options, Is that better? Okay, thanks for the help. So on the pipeline, any of the transmission mains, which every option has one, there were some assumptions on easements, land acquisition, those sort of things. And those will have to be done, just like you're talking about, going through different municipalities, routing. A routing study would have to be done immediately for any option you choose to see what the best one was. We did it on a mini scale on these options and said, okay, it doesn't look like a good idea to go through this railroad yard, so we won't go that way. We'll go this way. Here we're going to avoid, well, they're on the wetlands map. We won't go through the wetlands. Those sort of big picture decisions were made for all the routes, for all the alternatives, but more detailed routing would have to be done. And you're
Because
right,
that gets concerning because you start looking at a trickle-down economic theory where each one of these things are going to be bridged on, like, what's the upside of Joliet over the course of X amount of years? How much more land are we going to allocate? How many more people are we going to have? Do we, because you put yourself into a situation where you have to sell the water in order to have the control, if that's a scenario. You know, so those costs become, like, they start running out of control unless you have some sort of understanding. Like, our question would be, what's been the best practice that our neighbors have done over X years who have been in our same situation? Maybe not even in our region, maybe not in our state, but what are some of the best practices that other people have done to give us an understanding of possibly what we could do?
Right. I think that stuff would be in the next phase. I think you'd get into more detail on that. Absolutely.
Well, I think, again, just talking to the committee members or the council, we're in a position that other cities aren't. We're big enough that we have options that others don't. That's some of the cities that are here, I think at some point, I don't want to say they're forced, but they're probably going to piggyback on us. I think we know that. So we're kind of in the driver's seat.
So we do have that upside.
Yes.
Definitely. I mean, it takes a lot of momentum and leadership to get to this point. For another community to do that, it's almost late in the game.
And that's my concern as a resident, is the control, is that so?
Are there any other questions about the study so far? We thought that get it tonight, you take a look at it, and there'd be a tremendous amount of questions, and those would be filtered through Allison, and she'd compile them, and I don't know, she'd probably write them up and have answers and let everybody know all the questions that have been asked so far to date.
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
The plan is to write up all those questions and answers and email them to the Environmental Commission and to the City Council once a week.
Is that something we consider putting on the website? Because if we have them, other people will have the same questions.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. We can put the FAQs onto the website as well.
That'd be good.
Good idea.
All of the reports will be posted to the website tomorrow morning as well.
Very good.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We look forward to your questions and help to do anything we can to help you make a decision.
Thank you. Thanks for the input.
Thank you.
Okay, if everyone could, oh, come on. Hi, if everyone could go and come back to the group, we just want to finish up with a brief presentation on the next steps.
Done? So what you come up with? We're gonna dig another well or what?
dig two.
Dig too well.
Dig two.
Big rain dance.
Can I sit in your lap?
Oh, yeah, come on. And then I'll sit in,
No, you
yes, I
won't.
will. Sit in Terry's lap.
Yeah, now look at my, we got a lot of junk in that one.
Oh, bless you.
Okay, so the projectors are thinking, but I'll just go ahead and quickly run through what our next steps are. So tonight was the presentation of the phase two study results. We are, as I mentioned earlier, we're having a public forum on December 5th. That's going to be at 5 o'clock at the Cantigny VFW on Horseshoe Drive. Postcards to all Joliet residents will be going out next week with details about that and encouraging them to participate in that public forum. If you are not able to attend the public forum, we have many ways that you can still submit comments. You could email us at rethinkwater@joliet.gov. You could call us at the general utilities number, which is 815-724-4220, or you could go to the project-specific website, which is rethinkwaterjoliet.org, and there's a contact us form on the website. So many ways for the public to provide their input. As we mentioned earlier, then there's an environmental commission meeting on Tuesday, December 10th. That's going to be at 4:30 in the council chambers. And at that time, there'll be a discussion from the environmental commission and then ultimately a recommendation from the commission on the alternative water source. And then that would be presented to the city council for consideration on January 7th. So as I mentioned earlier, the work is really just beginning. Once we select a source, there's significant work to be done in the next year. We would start identifying regional partners. As I mentioned earlier, we had hosted an initial kickoff meeting with potential regional partners. We would continue those activities. We would develop and optimize a funding strategy. We would have those negotiations with water suppliers if needed for the selected alternative. We would select a design engineering firm. We would then proceed with the preliminary design, and that's where we would go into and finalize that transmission main routing and then also the siting for the water facilities. And with that, you would also have to begin land acquisition and easements, and we would continue to have meetings with regulatory agencies to further understand the permitting requirements. So again, the work is just starting. There's a lot to be done next year. So with that, that concludes the presentation portion, and this time we just open up to any public comments.
Okay, thank you. Anyone step forward, please?
I just wanted to make a comment because I think that this has been an interesting process for me for the last 15 months. I learned a lot more than I ever wanted to know about it. But I do believe that history should be a component of any decision. And I'd like to remind the council and everybody else in the Water Commission, Environmental Commission, that in the 1970s, while we were talking about doing it with, doing something on the Kankakee River, how, I will say foolish we might look today because we'd be doing this all over again from that point. So sustainability, cost, control, all of those things are important, but the component of what's gone on in the past and what have others done to solve this problem should be a part of the decision too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, my name's Bruce Renwick. I live at 1508 West Acres in Joliet. I think Commissioner Van Horn brought up an excellent point. Sustainability is critical to this thing because if you can't sustain what you're going to do, you're going to have to redo it, and it's going to cost you this much or more. The other question I've got is when you look at regional partners, are those regional partners able to take 30 million gallons of water a day?
So 30 million gallons a day was just estimated for the exercise. So we would finalize what that sizing would be once we understood better who wanted to participate.
I mean, just looking at them right now, I mean, you know what size towns they are, you know what their population is. Do you really think that they would take as much per day as Joliet would?
So the 30 MGD was based on assuming that all of the other deep well communities would want to participate in a regional solution. So that was the basis, that it was based on the deep well communities.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Damon Stunich, City of Joliet, 430 North Center Street. I do agree sustainability is important in these discussions for our long-term use of water. One of the things, I've been going to these meetings for the past year, and I started looking at what other cities have done, because we can learn from what other cities have done. The City of Aurora they had the opportunity to go to Lake Michigan back in the mid-90s. They chose not to. They developed a plan to utilize a combination of the Fox River along with their deep wells. They use, for example, a population of 200,000. They use on average of 83 gallons per day. Joliet's current use, looking at the city website, is about 126. That's 152% of Aurora's use. If we were to reduce that water per person, match what Aurora has done, our water needs are substantially reduced, but essentially by a third. If you take that, if we use that as a plan, if we try to be sustainable, we can match that and utilize a river like the Kankakee long term. There are some concerns about the Kankakee River not having water flow during the low periods. That could be solved similar to what the city of Atlanta did when they ran into an emergency need for water when their river ran dry. What they did is they worked with Vulcan Quarry on the Bellwood project done in Atlanta. So what did that do? That changed their emergency water supply from 3 days to like 30 days. The city of Joliet has that same opportunity. That quarry down off of Laraway Road that Vulcan owns could be dry in another 10 years. If the city of Joliet looked as a Kankakee source with the Vulcan Quarry as the reservoir for that, you would never have a situation where the Kankakee River is going to run dry on you. You'd also have, as the city of Atlanta did, another recreational area for the people to utilize. So when we look at all these huge costs that we're looking at, we also have to remember the ratepayer for the city of Joliet. These are huge numbers. And I've gone to a number of these meetings. I don't know why costs weren't brought up earlier, but I think if these kind of costs were brought up much earlier, a lot of city of Joliet people would be here right now wanting to hear more about it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mayor? Yes.
I just wanted to put out there, and this is speaking for myself, but I think a lot of us agree. I'm 56, so in 20 years I'll be 76, in 30 years I'll be 86, in 50 years I'll be dead for sure. My point is, though, this decision can't be made just based on the costs that we're going to consider and the availability within our lifetime. We've got to think about our kids and our grandkids. We've got to think about 50, 75, and 100 years. And we got to look for a way to spread that debt over that 50 years.
Anything else?
Just seek a motion to adjourn then.
Okay. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Great, thank you.
You got to vote? You got to vote. All in favor?
All in favor.
Aye.
I'm going to get one of these right. I think it was Turk and Sherry.